To discuss this with me here in the studio is Yahya Al-Aridi. He's a spokesman for the Opposition Syrian Negotiations Commission. We have Dani Maki, who's a freelance journalist and commentator on the Syrian conflict. And to give us the Turkish perspective is political analyst and author Onur Erim. Finally, completing our panel from Tehran is Said Mustafa Hosheshim. He's a specialist on Iranian affairs. Yahya Al-Aridi, let me begin with you. The Russian-Turkish-Iranian summit. They failed to get a ceasefire out of this. Was that expected? Did it disappoint you?
Well, it somehow disappointed us because we had high expectations that those three parties would behave responsibly towards putting an end to the tragedy in Idleb, or not to start it at least. It all goes back to the ceasefire, which started, the agreement began in Ankara in 2015. Unfortunately, it turned into Astana and a de-escalation zone, and the de-escalation zone was not respected. And that is what is happening now. All those skirmishes, all those bombardment that followed the summit. The second day, 80 of them. The second day, 60 of them are threatening the around 4 million civilians in Idlib. The pretext is the presence of Nusra. This can be solved if Turkey were to be given a little bit of time to settle this issue. Turkey is hard on this issue and it's working very hard on it.
So the group calling themselves Hayat Tahrir Sham, you believe they can be sorted out how?
They can be two ways. One is to dissolve themselves and for those foreigners just to be out of the country, out of Idlib, and thrown into the faces of those countries that threw them into Syria.
But that's not easy to do.
It's not easy to do, but it can be done. You have, if there is will, there is way, and all could cooperate. But not, they are happy about this if there's an attack, because they know that civilians would be harmed more than them.
Right, and that's interesting because Dani Maki, Hayat Tahrir Sham are there. They control a big chunk of Idlib. They estimated around, I guess, 10,000 fighters, but they're 3 million civilians. And at the moment, and over the 7 years, it seems quite clear that the Russians and the Assad regime aren't too bothered about taking civilian lives. They're barrel bombing as we speak, those crude, horrible devices. Is the onslaught worth it?
Well, it's not a question of it being worth it. You've got to look at this from the perspective of the Iranians, the Assad government and the Russians, and their aim is to retake Idlib and finish this conflict as speedily as possible. Now, obviously, that does bring in the dimension of the humanitarian issue we've talked about, and as discussed, there's up to 4 million civilians. There's a lot of civilians there, but the pretext is not necessarily going to be HTCs in Hayat Tahrir Sham. You mentioned 10,000. There's between 10 and 15,000 of these fighters, but there is a significantly larger amount of other rebel forces and fighters in Idlib, bringing it up to possibly 70,000 or 80,000.
Okay, so let's take the absolute maximum from you. Say it's 80,000 bad guys and 4 million civilians, and you're going to kill a lot of those 4 million civilians and displace a whole lot of them along the way if you bombard indiscriminately. Is it worth it?
I mean, from the viewpoint of retaking Idlib for the Assad government, they would deem it as worth it because for them, it's ending the conflict. I mean, the Russians have helped instigate this as well. I mean, they've been at the forefront of the bombardment which has happened over the previous week. So from their perspective, this isn't a case of the humanitarian issue. This is a case of finishing and ending this war. Now, the consequences for the humanitarian element are terrible because you've got a lot of civilians and there is the fear of the Daraa scenario repeating itself, where you're going to have possibly hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped on the border areas. Now, that will pressure Turkey as well. So in that regard, there is a high risk potential for this offensive and operation. But in terms of what the Assad government have done, they've been very unpredictable. I mean, no one expected Daraa to happen in the way it did. So Idlib, you know, anything could happen, but the scope of this offensive could be something limited or it could be something far more penetrative and deep. If it's deeper, then the humanitarian consequences are going to be far greater.
Onur Erim, why wasn't Turkey able to convince its partners? I don't know, it's a weird word, partners, but they are partners, they were at the same table. Why wasn't Turkey able to convince the Iranians and the Russians to stop this and to a ceasefire?
Let's fast forward a little bit, 6 months, a year, couple of years, who knows. But at the end of the day, we know that both the Russians and the Iranians want to be in the region. Idlib, taking over Idlib on either side could be more of a symbolic move, but it's a very strategic move. It's almost in the middle of the northern part of the country's routes for going either east or west. But the thing is, we know for a fact that the Russians want to be in Syria, at least in this part of Syria, to remain, and so do the Iranians. Now, Trump said 5 months ago that they want to be out of Syria very quickly. With the coming of James Jeffries on board as a special envoy to their State Department, did 180 on that fact, saying that they're here to remain until the Iranians are at least out of the Syria. So it looks like that everybody is trying to put their best move forward to make sure they're in this region for years to come.
Right. President Erdogan said this operation would turn Idlib into a lake of blood. Are we going to see us getting to a point at which Turkey says enough, no more cooperation and no more partnership with you, Russia, no more cooperation and no more partnership with you, Iran, because you're killing too many people? Will that happen?
Well, we have to realize Turkey is the only country in this mess that will be directly affected by what's going on.
Because of the border.
Because of the border issue and because of the humanitarian issues. Now, Turkey has been doing this since the first Iraqi war, has been helping the people of this region regardless of what happened. Because when it comes to humanitarian aid, Turkey never turned its back against anybody. It doesn't matter who was in power for years going back. But yes, when Turkey feels that it's threatened to the point that its borders are being compromised, that there are people being killed, massacred. You said 4 million civilians in the area. Don't forget, a quarter of that population is children. Turkey is going to do something about it. And yes, it will say no to whomever it needs to say no to. Because Turkey is already carrying a massive 3.5 million refugees, spending 3 times the amount UN does on refugees. Right. And Turkey cannot take any more. Nor can it just sit and watch what's going on.
Okay, and at the very end, I'll get all of your thoughts on what might happen if any of these major powers will butt heads and maybe even clash within the area. Let me go to you, Said Mustafa Hoshcheshim. Is the attack on Idlib justified?
Of course, there is no other option. There is no other viable option. Every time the terrorists take people as their shield in order to, force the Syrian army or any other army or state away, the other options available are very few. In this case, we've seen similar incidents in Aleppo, in Daraa, in eastern Ghouta, and the Syrian army and its allies proved that they take every possible avenue in order to avoid human casualties. But the danger is that the same terrorist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Nusra Front, as well as many thousands of ISIL that have moved from eastern Syria to Idlib, they might spread their rule to other regions, and they might, be a danger to the Turkish territories
and understood,
as
people
well.
don't like those groups, right? But when you said that Assad takes every precaution to protect civilian lives, after these 7 years, can you honestly say that? We've got reports just over the weekend. Barrel bombs in Al-Habit and Abdin villages in southern Idlib and other little hamlets and villages in the area. They're still using those barrel bombs. They're dropping them from the sky. And in 72 hours, according to the SOHR, Assad and Russia hit rebel-held areas more than 1,000 times from the sky. You're telling me they're taking every possible avenue to avoid civilian casualties. It's one thing to say it's justified in winning ugly and killing innocents along the way. It's another thing to deny that they're not very discriminate, are they? You can agree to that.
I may not approve of the independence and the preciseness of the source that you're using for this piece of item, for this piece of news about the barrel bombs. But the point is that we've been hearing so many things similar to this before. But eventually, what has happened on the ground and has been approved by many of independent sources in the West and the East, even by Turkey, we have seen that the Syrian army has done whatever it could, like striking compromise deals, giving amnesty to the ones that lay down their arms, also establishing safe
yes
corridors for the people to get out.
Have barrel bombs been used, yes or no?
I have no information about. I have no information about that. That's your code. That's your piece of item or news. I have never ever seen about this recent incident that you're just talking about. I have not seen any piece of news confirming that the Syrian army has used barrels. But let me
prior to this weekend, has the Syrian army ever dropped barrel bombs on civilian
Turkey
areas?
Very soon.
Has the Syrian army ever dropped barrel bombs on civilian areas in the past 7 years?
Not on residential areas. What I've seen actually is that they've been using various types of ammunition and various types of armaments against terrorist centers and strongholds. Let me get back to one of the points that you just raised.
Hold on.
Ever since 2 years ago.
Hold on. Let me bring in Yahya Al-Aridi, because we're going to circle back to the beginning now, and we'll come back to you, Mr. Hosheshem. Yahya Al-Aridi, you've heard from Danny, you've heard from Onur, and you've heard from Sayyid Mustafa Hosheshem. Let me circle back to you. Let me ask you to comment.
Well, first, Mr. Makki said something about al-Assad deserving to get Idlib to his legitimacy, as if Assad is a legitimate body, as if he got a legitimate government. Actually, the one who kills his own people is not legitimate.
When did he lose his legitimacy?
He lost his legitimacy immediately when he just directed bullets to the chest of Syrians asking for freedom in a peaceful way.
Danny, is he a legitimate president?
Well, first of all, I did not make that comment. My comment was that Assad will retake Idlib to finish the war.
Okay, but is he a legitimate president in your eyes?
The legitimacy of Assad can only be given by the Syrian people, and you've got a majority of the Syrian people within the country, you've got a portion of them outside the country, you've got others as refugees. We can't indicate to what extent that legitimacy is represented among the people. What you can say, however, is that within government-held areas, Assad is a legitimate president. That's not up to me to decide, and it's not judged by international support. This is what Syrians within government-held territory believe.
Okay.
Well, probably it takes us a longer time to discuss legitimacy or illegitimacy. But however, for your guest from Tehran, actually he talks about terrorism and denying the use of barrel bombs. I'll show this picture with your permission. This is a terrorist. The terrorist he was talking about. This is the result of the barrel bombs.
Where's that from?
This is from Idlib. This is Umayya Ayman Aruz, a child who fled with her family when she was around 2 months, and now she didn't finish her year, and she was killed by those barrel bombs. And those are the terrorists they are talking about, and they are being used as pretexts for invading Idlib.
Would you accept,
terrorizing for
so would you accept among these millions of civilians and innocent people, you have groups that are fairly unpalatable, who also do terrible things, and that within that, however crude and however indiscriminate, they are, especially if you're Al-Qaeda, they are legitimate targets within Idlib?
Amran, the people of Idlib want Nusra and want anybody who just does any kind of terrorism out of their land, more than anybody else. Frequently they have been used, those Nusra and others are being used as pretexts to do horrible things and to perpetrate massacres against civilian people, more than anybody else, more than those who are planning to invade Idlib, more than even the alliance, more than the Russians or Iranians or whatever. Now, the question to your guest from Iran, what is Iran doing in Syria? Is its national security threatened by anybody? Do we Syrians threaten Iran? Why are they there in the
well,
first place?
Okay, Said Mustafa Hoshchesham, do you want to tackle that? Help us understand what Iran's doing in Syria and what it says it's doing in Syria.
First of all, with regard to the program, you know that I cannot see you because I don't have any monitor. Probably your guest was displaying some pictures, photos, maybe, I don't know. But we've seen so many false flag chemical operations ever since this war
I'll send
started.
you the picture.
We've seen so many
I'll
fake
send you the
news
picture,
and
my
with
friend.
many fake videos.
Not
and
fake,
many,
not fake.
many
I don't
fake
fake
pictures.
things.
We've
Sorry.
seen so many fake pictures.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
If you can't hear me, I'll send you the
when
picture.
you were talking. Would you please let me talk? Would you please let me talk?
Sure.
You
sure.
asked me a question. Let me get through with it. Okay. You have time to defend your ideas. Okay. Fine. I don't know. I said I cannot see the program now. But the point is that we've seen so many fake news about the people, the kids that were bombed and they were sitting in the back of an ambulance. Later on, it came to be, just a fake piece of news. But with regard to your question about your words about legitimacy, we've seen election also in Syria when people have voted for President Bashar al-Assad, especially in those areas that have been liberated. Now people are showing support for President Assad. But with regard to Iran and Syria have long had, for the last 2 decades, they have had defensive pacts. Now, we all agree that there are many foreign terrorists that you just said that they need to be back home abroad. They have come to Syria. They are fighting Syria. And Syria requested Iran for aid. It also requested Russia for aid, according to the defense agreements that they had. In the meantime, ISIL, that was the strongest and most powerful terrorist group in Syria, its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, stressed on 2 occasions when he was asked why they don't go to Israel and they are moving eastward. He said, Israelis are our cousins and we don't have any problem with there. We are going eastward because of the Shiite Iran. And he stressed that. That was, and that is still their main and prime, purpose.
Okay, so
instead of fighting each other.
Okay, so that's the mindset. Let me understand, Danny. There's this kissing point at which the Syrian government or regime, in Yahya's eyes, and to many other Syrians who would accept the help of the Iranians and accept the help of the Russians. But ultimately, who's calling the shots here?
Well, it depends. I mean, of course, they've accepted Iranian and Russian support because at a time when the Syrian government was on the verge of collapsing as a state and as an entity, it was the Iranians and latterly the Russians who helped both save the government from what was a relatively slow demise, and in terms of the Russians, turn the tide of the war. So Assad is now a winner in the war. That's a fact that no one can escape from. The issue at hand is not one of legitimacy. I mean, these arguments were at the start of the conflict. Now we're 8 years down the line. We're looking at what's going to happen in the country in the future. You've got this Idlib operation now, and that is the main issue, it's the main topic at the moment. And look, the picture, and there are lots of images of kids being killed, of the human cost of this conflict, and it's reprehensible. I think we're all here in agreement relatively that all civilian losses and casualties are reprehensible, and we should raise awareness of the fact that there are those on government hands as well, and there are government civilian casualties as well. It's all reprehensible, but in order to find,
right?
to an extent, I mean, I wouldn't say it's completely.
Do you disagree with the fact that the state, or what's left of it, has disproportionately killed civilians, even more than Daesh?
Look,
I mean, it's fact, according to the United Nations.
Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed in Syria. And it's reprehensible throughout how they've been killed or who's killed them.
But every credible study by international institutions show that the state has killed more people than anybody else. You'd accept that?
Danny,
civilians have been killed as collateral damage.
The use of the passive here is not.
No.
Have been killed.
Of course they've been killed. Look, civilians have been killed on both sides. To reject that statement is very naive. What we should say is that it's reprehensible. The government has killed civilians through bombing areas. Look, no one would disagree with that. It's a fact. But the question is, in order to prevent this happening in the future, what's going to be done? Because all of the policies which have been taken so far haven't prevented that, either in Ghouta or Aleppo or Daraa. And what we've got now is, you've got a reality here where the government's won the conflict. You can't escape that. What can now be done to help prevent this scenario happening in Idlib? That's the main question we've got to ask today.
Onur Erim, what is Turkey preparing for?
I think Turkey is preparing for the worst because it has seen in the past for many years, before Syria, even before Iraq. We have to realize a couple of things at hand. Turkey is not only concerned about its border. Let's not forget that Turkey also has, I think, about 12 observatory posts in there right now. So it's a smaller group of the army, but it's also a concern. The thing is, Russia, Iran, they don't have to be in this region. U.S. doesn't have to be in this region. We are in this region, and we have to because we're right here. If anything happens, we have to realize we are out of the escalation zones in Syria. If Idlib turns into a catastrophic, chain of events, probably triggered by both Assad, maybe with the help of Russia and Iran, this area will be a bloodbath, and Turkey will suffer this the most. But what they don't realize is, out of this catastrophic humanitarian, bloodbath, everybody will suffer. Assad will suffer. Iran will suffer. Russia will suffer. U.S., Europe, they will all suffer. Of course, their sufferings will be in a different way. The people, the children of the region will unfortunately, I hope not, unfortunately will pay with their lives. But out of this, if this goes through, if what Turkey is very afraid of actually happens with the help of Assad, Russia, Iran, and whomever else, this is what is going to happen. Also, let's not forget, we have been talking about the rebels or the terrorists in the area. Nobody's, except for HTS right now, in the past week with President Erdogan, declaring them as a terrorist group. There's not a consensus of who is and who's not a terrorist in the region. Let's not also forget, we had a little conversation here about Assad being a legitimate leader or not. We know, not many of us discuss, but we know that Assad is not the leader anymore, at least not the Syria that we know of. Let's accept this fact first. Assad may be the leader of...
Danny doesn't accept that.
Of course not, because Assad is the leader of whatever entity is governing Syria at the moment. He may not be the leader of what Syria was before the conflict, but he's definitely leader of Syria at its current state, regardless of what the issues of legitimacy are and the questions that people may have. I mean, that's something which at the moment, given the scenario Syria is in at the moment, it's an issue which shouldn't be debated because it's an issue which has been fought over for 8 years. This very issue has come after 8 years of conflict. So it's no longer an issue which is worth debating at the moment because it's become so polarized, where you have Russia backed by Iran and Russia has essentially established what he has established at the moment. And the opposition, what have they done to counter this or approach Assad in a way where you may have a rapprochement one day? How do you break this polarization of this conflict, which is leading up to what may be a catastrophic situation in Idlib for not just for everyone involved? Hundreds of thousands of trapped civilians is not something which will lead to the end of the Syria conflict. But what I do think, one last point, is definitely the West have approached the Idlib situation in a very amateurish way, because they've almost given in essence, a green light for the Russians and the Iranians to attack.
Yahya al-Aridi, is that a point at which you would agree with Danny Mackey? Maybe the only one, that the West has been naive?
Well, the West has been naive. I don't disagree with that at all. But let me just elaborate on one particular point raised by Danny, that we need a constructive way in order to approach this thing that has been on for about 7 years or plus. Now, there is a political process that to which the regime hasn't gotten involved at all, and with the help of its supporters. Now, Syrians, in whichever entity they are, with the exception of the entity he is in control of, do not consider their conflict with Assad now to be a military one, as they did from the very beginning. It is a conflict of rights. It's a political one. There are UN Security Council resolutions that talk about political transition, and nobody is paying attention to these things. Now we know that in Geneva today there are talks about one of the basic pillars for the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions. If Russia, the main supporter of the regime, doesn't get into that and get the implementation of 2254, it will continue in this bloodbath for a long time, and there are parties who want Russia to be in such a thing, in particular Iran. And one thing about Daesh, well, I'll ask your guest from Tehran.
We don't have time.
Just one little thing. Who just supervised, who took care of the buses that transferred Daesh from Western Syria to Eastern Syria?
Can we have that debate another time between you, Yahya, and Saeed Mustafa? Because we're out of time. I've got to move on to Yemen. But gentlemen, it's been great having you all on the program. Saeed Mustafa Hoshchesham, Onur Erim, Danny Maki, and Yahya Al-Aridi. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers.